Good morning, boys and girls. Today we are going to start our lesson 13-5, comparing fractions using benchmarks. Let's look at our problem. Mr. Evans wrote 2 eighths, 4 eighths, 6 eighths, 1 eighth, 3 eighths, 5 eighths, and 7 eighths on the board. Then he circled the fractions that are closer to 0 than to 1. Which fractions did he circle? Which fractions did he not circle? Explain how you decided. So the first thing we want to do is set up our work mat with fractions closer to 0. And over on this side, we're going to write fractions closer to 1. Now let's take a look at the fractions that he wrote. The first fraction I see that he wrote is 2 eighths. So if I look at my fraction bars and I slide 2 eighths up, 1, 2, I see that 2 eighths is closer to 0 than it is to 1. So this would be one of the fractions that Mr. Evans circled. So we're going to write down here 2 eighths in the section that's closer to 0. The next fraction I see is 4 eighths. 1, 2, 3, 4. When I look at 4 eighths, I see that 4 eighths is neither closer to 0 nor to 1 because that is a fraction that is exactly halfway between the two. Let's look at 6 eighths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 eighths is closer to 1 than it is to 0. So I'm going to write 6 eighths over on the closer to 1 fraction. And then I have 1 eighth. Let me slide these back down. 1 eighth, we can clearly see, is closer to 0. Now when I write it down here, I'm going to write it before that 2 eighths just because I like to keep them in least to greatest order. The next number that I see that he wrote, the next fraction, is 3 eighths. So I'm going to slide up 3 eighths, and I notice that 3 eighths is closer to 0 than it is to the 1, and it will come after the 2 eighths. 3 eighths. The next one is 5 eighths. So we have 3 eighths, 4 eighths, 5 eighths. 5 eighths has passed the halfway point. It is closer to 1. So I'm going to write 5 eighths on the closer to 1 side, and since it is less than 6 eighths, I'm going to write it before the 6 eighths. And the final one that he wrote was 7 eighths. If I slide up 6 and 7 eighths, again, I see that 7 eighths is closer to 1. When I look at these, I know the fractions closer to 0 are the ones that he circled. And the fractions closer to 1 are the fractions he did not circle. Now, let's go ahead and flip over to the next side. And when I look at this side, I see Carrie wants to buy 2/6 of a container of roasted peanuts. Alan wants to buy 2/3 of a container of roasted peanuts. The containers are the same size. Who will buy more peanuts? It's always important for us to remember that we are comparing containers or whole numbers that are the same size that are to be divided into fractions. So another strategy to compare fractions is to use those common benchmark numbers such as 0, 1/2, and 1. Part B, let's see how we're going to solve. We're going to compare each fraction to the benchmark number 1/2. Then see how they relate to each other in size. So I'm going to remove my eighths down here toward the bottom, and I'm going to take out my 2/6. sixths. 1, 2. And I can see that 2 sixths is less than 1 half. And we could write that like this. 2 sixths is less than 1 half. I'm going to look at my next measurement, and it's 2 thirds. So I'm going to take my 2 thirds, and I can see that 2 thirds is greater than 1 half. And this would be written like this. 2 thirds is greater than 1 half. So 2 sixths is less than 2 thirds because 2 thirds is greater than 1 half. So Alan will buy more peanuts than Carrie. Let's go ahead and look at our next page. And I see that we have number 1. Tina used benchmark numbers to decide that 3/8 is less than 7/8. Do you agree? And then explain. Well, let's take a look. First of all, our denominators are the same. So to remember back to previous lessons, we know that if our denominators are the same, we simply have to compare the numerators to decide which one is greater. So when I look at 3/8, and that is 3 parts of 8, I know that it is less than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7/8. So 3/8 is less than 7/8. The next part says write 2 fractions with a denominator of 6 that are closest to 0 then to 1. So I know that I'm working with my 1/6, and if I pull my 1/6 out and place them on my work mat, I can see that 1/6 and 2/6 are both closer to 0 than they are to 1. Those are the two that I'm going to write. 1/6 and 2/6 are both closer to 0. Number 3 says write 2 fractions with a denominator of 8 that are closer to 1 than to 0. This time we're going back to look at our 8s. So here's 4/8, 5/6/8, 7/8, and 8/8, which of course equals 1 whole. So when I look at my options here, I can see that I could write 6/8 and 7/8 are both closer to 1. 6/8 and 7/8 are both closer to 1 than to 0. In numbers 4 through 6, it tells us to choose from the fractions 1/8, 1/4, or 6/8, and 3/4. Use fraction strips to help. So I'm going to go ahead and take away my 6 because I do not need the 6 because I have no denominator with 6. I do have denominators with 8s, and I have denominators with 4s. So with my fraction bars out here, it's going to be much easier for me to compare. It says, which fractions are closer to 0 than to 1? Well, the first one I'm going to look at is 1/8. Is 1/8 closer to 0 than to 1? Yes, it is. So the first one I'm going to write here is 1/8. Are there any others? 1/4. And we see that 1/4 is also closer to 0 than it is to 1. So the next fraction I'm going to write is 1/4. Now I see 6/8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6/8 is closer to 1 than to 0, so I will not write that one down. And then 3/4. 1, 2, and 3. 3/4 3/4 is also closer to 1 than it is to 0. So I will not write that one down either. For number 5, it says which fractions are closer to 1 than to 0? Well, now this time I can take those two that I already know were closer to 1, and those are going to be my answers for number 5. So let's take a look. I wrote down 1/8 and 1/4 were closer to 0. Let's check out 6/8. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6/8 is closer to 1 than 0. And let's check out 3/4. 1, 2, 3. 3/4 is also closer to 1 than to 0. Number 6. Use the two fractions with the denominator of 8 to write a true statement. So the two fractions that I had at the top were 1/8 and 6/8. And when I look at it, they're already telling me I want the comparison to be the first fraction is less than the second fraction. The denominators are the same, so I look at the number of parts. 1/8 is less than 6/8. So this would make our statement true. So on our independent practice, let's look at number 7. For 7 and 8, choose the fractions 2/3, 7/8, 1/4, and 2/6. Which of the fractions are closer to 0 than to 1? So I'm going to bring over my 2/3. 1, 2. When I look at my 2/3, I can see that it is definitely closer to 1 than 0. So I'm going to write closer to 1 than 0. Excuse me, boys and girls. That one is going to go down here. So 2/3 is closer to 1 than 0. Let's check out that 7/8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7/8 is also closer to 1 than to 0. 1/4, we can clearly see, is closer to 0 than 1. And 2/6. 1, 2. If I only have 2 of those 6, it also is closer to 0. So we can make comparisons using our benchmarks 0, 1/2, or 1 to compare fractions. But when we are comparing fractions, we can also remember the other strategies that we have learned with like denominators or like numerators. So we're going to use a variety of strategies for this bottom part. Number 9, 5/8 is what to 7/8? 5/8, the denominators are the same, so I automatically know I need to look, where do I have more pieces? I have more pieces on 7/8. So 5/8 is less than 7/8. Number 10, 5/8 to 2/8. Again, same denominator, 5 is a greater number of pieces, so 5/8 is greater than 2/8. Number 11, this time I have 3/4 and 3/6. Now remember, with a same numerator but different denominator, I have to look at which number is greater and which number is lesser. If my parts are divided into fourths, the smaller the number, the greater the piece, the bigger the piece, or the greater the number, the smaller the piece. So to refresh our memory from yesterday, let's take our fraction bars and look at this. I have 3/6, and I'm comparing it to 3/4. So since the 6 is a greater number of pieces in the whole, that makes the pieces each one smaller. And since the 4th is a lesser number of pieces of the whole, that makes 3 of those larger. So our answer for 3/4 compared to 3/6 is 3/4 is greater than 3/6. Number 12, 4/6 and 4/8. So if we need to take our bars again and match them up 4 to 4, we can clearly see that 4/6 is greater than 4/8, because remember, the greater the number, the smaller the pieces, and they're each 4 pieces. So 4/6 is greater than 4/8. Number 13, 2/6 compared to 2/4. The greater the number, the smaller the pieces. So 2/6 compared to 2/4. 2/6 is less than 2/4. Number 14, we have 2/3 and 1/3. Well, here we have the same denominator, so if our denominators are the same, remember we look at which numerator shows more pieces. So 2/3 is greater than 1/3. Turn your paper over. When we look at the back, we're going to start, as we do sometimes, with the very bottom, our assessment practice. Each of the fractions, number 22, each of the fractions in the comparisons at the right refer to the same whole. Remember, it's very important for us to know that they are referring to the same whole. Use benchmark fractions to reason about the size of each fraction. Select all the correct comparisons. So we're looking at 2/3 compared to 2/4. 2/3 to 2/4. They're saying 2/3 is less than 2/4. Is that a true statement? No, that is wrong. So we will not select that one. 2/4 is less than 2/3. Is that a correct statement? Yes, it is, because we can see 2/4 is less than 2/3. So we will fill in that space. 3/8 is greater than 5/8. Well, once again, same denominator. We have to compare the number of pieces. And 3 is less than 5, so this is not a correct true statement. 1/4 is less than 2/4. Again, our denominators are the same, so we simply compare the number of pieces in the numerator. 2 is greater than 1, so this is a true statement. 1/4 is greater than 2/4. And finally, 3/6 is greater than 3/8. So the greater the number, the smaller the pieces. So I think this one is going to be correct, but let's look at our fraction bars just to make sure. So we have 3/6 compared to 3/8, and they're saying that 3/6 is greater than 3/8. And yes, I was right, it is a true statement. Now, we skipped quite a few because I wanted to make sure I wasn't giving you too much work at one time. So let's look quickly at our homework assignment. So for lesson 13-5, I want you to complete numbers 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then on the back, we are just going to complete number 18. Again, at any time in this video, if you need to pause it so that you can catch up, feel free, or rewind so that you can refresh your memory or just hear it again. I hope that this lesson makes a lot of sense to you, and happy mathing!